So welcome to the big idea of Bitcoin. I thought I'd give an introductory session on what Bitcoin is. Just noticed there's a bit of misunderstanding or misinformation about what Bitcoin is exactly, which is not surprising. It's quite a complex domain to learn. So you're going to be hearing a lot about Bitcoin over the next decade, so it's important you know exactly what it is. So this is my attempt to summarize hundreds of hours of research sort of into one succinct session for beginners. So warning, this is not financial advice and it's just purely for educational purposes. Opinions expressed are solely my own, and you should always consult with a qualified advisor before making any investment decisions. So as this meme says, investing in Bitcoin is actually very stressful and it does age you. It's actually a very hard asset to hold. It's easy to buy, difficult to hold. So it's very impressive when I hear of people who have bought, 10 years ago and managed to hold through. People think it's easy. It's not at all. The volatility wrecks you. And even worse is that owning Bitcoin is still contrarian. And so there's a lot of people who are skeptical or doubters who will make it known on you, especially when it's in the bear market. So the only way to get through this is to understand exactly what Bitcoin is and also to understand the mission at large. It'll make it much easier for you to get through it. It also will make it easier if you have a community around you. If you don't have a community around you, find someone or go to a local Bitcoin meetups, and they exist in pretty much every major city. And finally, if you're in this really to get rich quick, you're not going to make it. You're going to be one of the first to sell when things go south, and I guarantee you the price will go down at some point and you will be underwater. That's when you are tested. That's when the winners are made. That's when the best buying opportunities are. But unfortunately, most people bail out because they don't know what they're buying. They don't believe in the mission or understand the mission at all. So yeah, if you want to get rich, you're not going to make it. It's not a get rich quick scheme, okay? Good. So why now? Why is this important now? So in the US, courts and regulators have both given Bitcoin the green light as a legitimate asset class. So according to US courts and regulators, Bitcoin is not a Ponzi scheme. It's not a scammy technology, okay? And so as a result of that, ETPs have been approved, not ETFs as is in this photo, but it's actually exchange traded products. And what that means is that institutions like BlackRock can offer access to Bitcoin, right? Offer exposure, so give people the opportunity to buy into Bitcoin without having to custody the Bitcoin themselves. It unlocks access to institutional grade wealth. So what's also happened in the last 6 to 8 months is the Financial Accounting Standards Board has introduced a significant update to the accounting standards for Bitcoin. It effectively makes it easier for public companies to hold Bitcoin as it provides more transparency and comparability between companies who hold Bitcoin on their balance sheet. So in 2013, I was wrong about Bitcoin. I thought it was a scam, and this is actually a normal start to most Bitcoiners. They all typically have an origin story where they thought it was at first a scam. And then in 2017, I was wrong about Bitcoin again, as I thought there would be a better Bitcoin. I also had concerns about its potential environmental impact. So again, two other things that aren't so abnormal and quite common among the community to have these concerns. But I'm now confident that I was wrong on all three of these points. So Bitcoin is a paradigm. Okay, so it requires a paradigm shift in understanding about a number of things, from technology but also to economics. And Bitcoin does touch on each of these domains. I mean, you don't have to be a domain expert in every single one of these to understand Bitcoin, but you have to understand at least the aspects of which it touches on. Okay, and this is why Bitcoin causes a lot of confusion, because you have a lot of technical people who come from sort of understanding about software or hardware, trying to understand Bitcoin, but they don't understand the economic side of it, or they don't understand the governance or regulation side of it. They may not understand how it affects energy markets. Okay, and vice versa. You can have people from economics or finance who don't understand the technology side of it. They may not understand the engineering or the physics of Bitcoin. So that sort of gap in knowledge can lead them to just automatically shut it down and assume that it's nonsense. But I can assure you that after doing some work around in these areas, Bitcoin makes total sense. So what is Bitcoin exactly? Simply put, it's open source software. And so it's not so different actually than, say, the internet, or in particular the TCP/IP underlying protocol. It's not so different from Mozilla Firefox, which is the open source browser for email. Not so different from Python, which is the dominant programming language, and not so different from Linux, which is the dominant operating system, and Git, which is the dominant revision control system. So not only are each of these the dominant open source software in their particular application, but they're all open source, they're decentralized, they're permissionless, and they're neutral. Each of them are fundamental to the world economy. In particular, the most obvious ones are internet, email, Python programming languages. Linux operating software is everywhere. It's used by most of cloud computing, and Git is incredibly important in programming. And so, yeah, most of the world economy now is built on these open source protocols, and I foresee a future where Bitcoin will be a new addition. So to understand Bitcoin, it's best to, perhaps easiest to compare it to the internet. Okay, so with the internet is basically, you could break it down as an abundant information transfer protocol. So what I mean by that is information can be copied. Okay, so I can send, say, a music file to someone else, but I can still hold that music file. I can send it to many people, and then those people can send that music file to other people. This one application of the internet disrupted entire industries, being able to copy information and send it around in a permissionless manner. Bitcoin is like that, but opposite, in that information can only be custodied by one person or one entity at a time. So packets of information can be sent around, but they cannot be copied. So the internet creates abundance of information. Bitcoin creates scarcity of information. An important point in understanding this is that it is the protocol itself that creates the scarcity. It doesn't require a centralized party or an issuer to make the information scarce like we have today. So we have currently an internet that's built, and we have entities like banks, central banks, that create sort of artificial scarcity because they're issuing or they're controlling the scarcity themselves. You require trust in this institution to create scarcity of information. Whereas in Bitcoin, the scarcity comes from within the protocol itself, and there's no one to trust. There's no central party controlling or preventing the double spending of that information. So again, both are open source, decentralized, permissionless, and neutral. Important to understand about how the internet works is through layering, okay? And this has been built up over 50 years or so. We have all the way at the bottom a physical layer, moving all the way up to the application layer that we sort of interact with. We understand this is how we interact with the internet, through the application layer. Important to note in all of these layers is the TCP/IP protocol, and this is sort of the foundational core to the internet. And this would be akin to the Bitcoin blockchain, which I'll talk about in a second. But this was designed in the 70s, but first implemented in the 80s. And importantly has maintained the primarily backwards compatible updates just to ensure smooth and stable improvement. And this is incredibly important to understand how Bitcoin is developed. And Bitcoin develops in line with this strategy. And it really is important to ensure backwards compatible updates only, because otherwise you can have major disruptions to the layers above, break the internet or cause significant downtimes on the internet, which would cause massive disruptions to the economy. Bitcoin, again, like the internet, is scaling in layers. We also have a physical layer through mining, nodes, and energy. We have the settlement layer, which is typically the layer that everyone understands Bitcoin as. This is what you call the base layer, or the blockchain layer. The settlement layer is optimized for security, okay? Whereas the fast layer, which is being built above that, is optimized for speed. But the trade-off is that in order to be fast, we have to sacrifice some decentralization. So it's a little bit less secure. But you don't put much capital on the fast layer. Most of your capital is on the secure settlement layer. Smaller capital goes on the fast layer, but slightly less secure layer. And then you have the smart layer too. So this is where things get interesting, in that you can actually program the Bitcoin to do interesting things. So, and then above that is the application layer, so the wallets or the ETFs and how people like us interact with Bitcoin itself. Okay, so the application layer doesn't have to be on top of all of this. It can be an application layer at each layer, of course. But just to give you some sort of reference here. So, an important point that I want to take you through is the understanding that Bitcoin is both a protocol and an asset. Okay, so I'm going to start with just understanding the protocol piece to it. So here's the settlement layer. This is the blockchain layer that everyone knows and understands Bitcoin as. And here's the blockchain. On top of that is built the fast layer. This is the lightning layer. Okay, so people would typically save at the base layer, the secure settlement layer, and transact on the fast layer. So this is what is available now that people can do now, today. Also, more recently, in the last year, Tara Network has been released onto mainnet, and this unlocks more potential for all sorts of more interesting applications. Okay, and so this is more in the experimental stage, but what's looking like on the horizon is that we're going to be able to do a few cool things with the help of sort of neobanks and tech companies, is to issue fiat currencies, so being able to route currency, like the US dollar, on top of Bitcoin infrastructure. Okay, so basically reducing the friction of moving money around. We can actually build on top of Bitcoin the infrastructure for routing US dollar or Australian dollar on top of the Bitcoin network. Thus, because it's open source software, it makes it cheaper to do this. It's not on proprietary rails. So therefore you can have greater reach of those currencies into other jurisdictions of the world. It also unlocks the potential for issuing stocks, okay, on top of Bitcoin. So again, using Bitcoin infrastructure to move stock certificates around, potentially even allowing people to self-custody their own stock certificates again. This, if you've ever tried to move stock around to different brokerages, you'll know that it's an absolute pain. This would help reduce that friction, and it would make it 24/7 trading and potentially peer-to-peer trading. Again, this is what the technology unlocks. Whether the regulators in the US or in other jurisdictions will allow that to happen is another question. So Bitcoin is both a network or protocol or infrastructure, as well as an asset itself. Okay, so how visualize that? So I've got the infrastructure here, and I can route the Bitcoin on top of the infrastructure. So I can route Bitcoin little b, the asset, on top of Bitcoin capital B, the network or the protocol. So another point I want to make is people criticize Bitcoin because at the settlement layer, the base layer, you can't buy a $5 cup of coffee with Bitcoin without it costing, say, $2, $3, maybe even $5 in fees. Right, so that does hinder commerce at that level. Okay, but what people fail to tell you is that it costs the same in fees for buying a coffee as it does for sending billions of dollars across the world. And there was an example just in the last few months, someone sending $1.35 billion for $2 in fees. Okay, so that you could not do that with any other infrastructure at this moment. Try sending $1.35 billion on the current infrastructure across the world. Either A, you couldn't do it, or it'd be significantly a lot of compliance to get through, and it will also cost you a lot of money. Try sending that much money with gold. Incredibly expensive to do that with gold. Okay, so the point here is Bitcoin at the base layer is optimized for large transactions. There's theoretically no limit in size in terms of the value of the transaction. It's no different. It's no different if you want to send $10 billion on the Bitcoin base layer to the Bitcoin protocol. That is no different than sending $1. 10 billion is no different than sending $1. So it's really optimized for large transactions. Right? So 1.35 billion is like moving Capita Spring in Singapore building, the entire building across the world. That's how much money that is. And you can spend your $5 buying a coffee for a penny on the fast layer, on the Lightning layer. Okay, and this exists now. It's been around for a few years already. It's not news anymore. So this is how you achieve security and speed with Bitcoin. There's 3 layers. Okay, so here is an illustration, a poor illustration, nonetheless. Trying my best here. But this is the Bitcoin blockchain settlement layer, okay? Decentralized, many computers talking to each other. Equivalent in the current infrastructure is, say in the US, it would be called FedNow or FedWire. That's the infrastructure used in the US to settle payments between institutions and the central banks. Okay? So that would be equivalent. These are equivalent. Not the transaction layer. So people mistakenly compare Bitcoin blockchain with Visa, MasterCard, or SWIFT. No. Lightning, Liquid, and Arc, the transactional layers, are equivalent to Visa, MasterCard, SWIFT. Okay? Second layers. These are the secondary layers. These are the primary base layers. Now, they're quite different though. Bitcoin is permissionless, decentralized, and neutral. Fiat is permissioned, centralized, and partial. So quite a significant difference between the two in terms of how it's architected. And these differences are going to have a massive implication on which architecture is going to succeed in the long run. So what is the big idea here? Bitcoin is unified infrastructure for the transfer and storage of scarce information. That's a little bit of jargon just to say that Bitcoin is the internet of money. And that's a good book, that's worth a read. So Bitcoin as money. Money can be broken down into 3 major categories: store of wealth, medium of exchange, and unit of account. And I've further broken down these categories into its constituent properties. And I've added in a couple for the sake of future monies that is going to be required. So for example, censorship resistance is going to be an interesting trait for digital monies of the future, as well as programmability. So just a quick brief history of money. There are 2 types of money in the world at the moment. There's the ledger money, which you can think of as like the US dollar or Australian dollar. And then there's commodity money. And commodity money is things like gold and silver. They've been the predominant winners in terms of commodity money. But in the past, there's also been money in terms of seashells, rocks, salt, beef, wheat, for example. So ledger money is secured by trust. Okay, so there's trust required of a government or an issuing party like the central bank in order to not corrupt the ledger and not debase the ledger too much, which means not to print more money than is absolutely necessary. Commodity money is secured by physics, so one cannot spend gold twice because of physics, because you cannot print more gold. So if I hold a bar of gold and I pass that gold on to you, I no longer have the gold, and so nature is keeping a track of the ledger effectively by your possession of that money. When we look at how they're established, ledger money is in a top-down fashion, so it's issued by decree from the government. Okay, and so because you already trust that government, because you've elected that government into power, the money that the government issues or makes legal tender inherits that trust. Okay, so it's a very important point to understand with fiat currencies that trust is inherited by the government that has been elected and by the people. Commodity money doesn't have this inherent trust. It has to earn its trust over time because there is no issuing party. So it's a bottoms-up money. It's established and recognized by the people at large. And gold is largely considered the best money out of all commodity monies because it is the most scarce, most durable commodity money. So the network has agreed through consensus that gold is the best commodity money historically. This is the pre-fiat era. Governance. So ledger money is centralized in its governance, and that is controlled by an issuing party, and so they can control the money supply. Commodities are decentralized in that no one has control over the supply, and it's actually nature itself that controls it. But also more important is that no one can make adjustments to the properties of your money if it's commodity money because it's decentralized. So if I hold a bar of gold and you hold a bar of gold and you start tampering with the properties of your gold, it doesn't affect mine. Whereas the ledger money, they can totally affect the properties of your money as they wish. So Bitcoin is an interesting case in that it sits in between both of these types of monies. It is uniquely a ledger commodity money. So it's literally a ledger, just like these fiat currencies are. However, the ledger is distributed over many tens of thousands of computers all around the world. And it's secured by physics. So energy is required. If you wanted to break Bitcoin, you need vast amounts of energy and computational power to do that. So it's actually secured by physics. So like commodity money, it's secured by physics. It's established in a bottoms-up fashion, so it's established by the people who are working out through consensus whether this money is legitimate or not. And its governance, like commodity money again, is decentralized in nature. So no one without your permission can adjust or make changes to your Bitcoin. You don't have to believe me. You can research this yourself and find out that it is in fact decentralized. It is the most decentralized digital money around. And in fact, like I said earlier, the US regulators and courts have also agreed that Bitcoin is decentralized to be classed as a commodity. So bottoms-up money takes time to mature. Okay, so bottoms-up money and top-down money have different go-to market strategies, if you like. They have different pathways to emergence. So bottoms-up money typically starts out as collectible because it's an interesting hobby and it's something that's unique and interesting. But then over time, it proves itself as a store of value because no one can print any more of it or create any more of this money. And once it's starting to prove itself as a store of value, and there's enough users who all agree that this thing stores value, it can then mature into a medium of exchange. It's extremely difficult for a bottoms-up money to become a medium of exchange before store of value because it's not trusted. How do you know as a merchant that you're receiving this new money that someone wants to use? How do you know and trust that it will hold its value? If it doesn't hold its value, then you're going to have to sell it for another better money, and you don't want to have to take on that risk as a merchant. So the network effect has to kick in for it to become an accepted medium of exchange. And then once it's an accepted medium of exchange, it can become a unit of account, and this means that you price things in that money. So if you're in Australia, you'd price things in Australian dollars. If you're in the US, you price things in the United States dollar. So when you rank and compare the three different types of money, Bitcoin, fiat, and gold, Bitcoin's fundamental properties for store of wealth are extremely good. It's scarce, durable, verifiable, and has censorship resistance built into it. Medium exchange is also at a fundamental level, has great properties, and this is particularly through its scaling ability, the layers that we spoke about earlier. It's portable, extremely portable, divisible, fungible, and programmable. Okay, but you'll be saying, oh yeah, but it's not a medium of exchange. Sure, maybe it has the properties of a medium of exchange, but it's not being used as a medium of exchange. That is correct, because it's still proving itself in the store of wealth phase. But also, and very importantly, it's actually good money, and it's because it's maturing, and proving itself as a store of wealth, it's being monetized, and that means the value of it is going up over time. And so we call this phenomenon Gresham's law, where regarding the circulation of money, bad money drives out the good. So when you have a good money, so money considered more valuable, and then you have bad money competing with bad money, money considered less valuable, the good money is saved, whereas the bad money is spent. So what you see in circulation is the money that is less valuable. You can see this as an example with gold and silver. Silver was the money that was in circulation more than gold. People stored the gold. It was more valuable. Why do you want, if you've got a choice to spend something, to offload something in your possession, why would you offload the good money first? You offload the bad money as long as someone's willing to accept it, right? It's kind of like a game of hot potato in that sense. Then over time, Thiers' law will kick in. So regarding circulation, the good money eventually drives out the bad. And this is effectively because it's forced upon people to start having to spend their good money, because the bad money has lost its value. And it's lost its value typically through hyperinflation. And then because it's been hyperinflated, it is no longer accepted, and then you're forced to use the good money. So during Zimbabwe's hyperinflationary period, many citizens resorted to using US dollars despite their prohibition, and many foreign currencies also were circulated in the Weimar Republic during the 1920s. So there's many good examples out there of Thiers' law in practice. And you can also see this, had seen this in El Salvador and Argentina. And then finally, for unit of account, Bitcoin doesn't tick any of these boxes yet because it's quite volatile, so it's not stable. And it's becoming trusted, so it's in that process of being trusted. It is trusted to some extent by a few million people, but it's not trusted at large for it to become a unit of account, and then obviously it's not as an accepted unit of account, whereas fiat ticks all those boxes. And gold does do well in its stability and it's trusted, but it's not a largely accepted unit of account. So we can tally up the result of this comparison. Bitcoin is coming out on top with green on 8 of the 11 properties. Fiat or dollars coming second, and then gold last. The good thing about Bitcoin is that the areas it needs to improve on can and will happen over time. So it's things like it needs more trust, right? So that's only a time thing, and it needs more stability. So that'll happen when the size of Bitcoin gets larger, and then it will need to be accepted eventually. So that's just a consequence of the network agreeing upon it as a unit of account. Now, fiat, in order for it to compete with Bitcoin, it needs to become more scarce, but that's sort of the antithesis of the economic system that it's in. So that would be quite unlikely, I'd say. And then censorship resistance is very low, and I think that's for political reasons. They want to be able to censor, so there would have to be a sort of a change in policy for that to happen, but it's possible. Gold is not easily verifiable, it's not programmable, and at the moment not accepted, but that could change. Another dimension to look at and compare these three monies is how easy is it to transfer value over space and time. So gold, for example, not easy to send gold across the world. Right? That's what I mean by space. It's very expensive and dangerous and risky to move large amounts of gold. But it is good at sending value over time. Okay, so really great at sending value over the single dimension of time. Fiat is great at sending value over space. It's very cheap and easy to do compared to gold. But over time it's not so good because it loses its value due to inflation. And you wouldn't want to hold dollars for more than a couple of years, for example. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is great for sending value over space. It's incredibly cheap and fast, but also great at sending value over time. You can send Bitcoin 1,000 years into the future and it will retain its value. Again, if you don't believe me with these properties, that's fine, but I encourage you to do your own research. So because Bitcoin is going through its store of wealth phase, I thought it'd be good to sort of focus on this a little bit and also to show you why Bitcoin is incredibly important in the world. So how people typically in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US store their wealth is not through money, but actually through real estate or property. Okay, so this is the property price index for Australia. It's up and to the right, and it's been particularly good store of wealth since the year 2000. And the reason why people put their money and wealth into homes and real estate is because it's a scarce, desirable, and secure asset. And it's secure because in Australia we have strong property rights. In New Zealand we have strong property rights. Canada, the United States as well. We have very strong property rights, which means we have effective and generally low corrupt politicians, legal system, police, justice system, and military or defense force. The ownership of your home is literally a ledger on the government's database. You need strong property rights. So you need an effective and low corrupt police force and military, both to defend against local thieves or criminals, but also defend against foreign adversaries like foreign militaries invade and take your resources. So because we have strong property rights in Australia, we can store wealth in homes because it is largely protected by the system. And the reason we need to store our wealth in homes is because we have a phenomena in the economics system today called monetary inflation. So I've just added a new chart here of the money supply in Australia, and it is increasing, and particularly increasing more so from 2000, 2001 onwards. And so you need to protect yourself against the debasement of the money. So you don't want to hold the currency. You actually need to store your wealth in real estate. Now, this phenomena is the same across all of the other countries that I mentioned, New Zealand, US, Canada. They all, the property prices track monetary inflation. You can also see this phenomenon carrying out with the indexes, those stock indexes. Here I have the S&P 500 index overlaid with the monetary supply. And so again, people are using the indexes and the stocks and companies as a way to protect themselves from monetary debasement. In fact, if you divide the total market cap of the United States stock market by the M2 money supply, you'll notice that actually it's not a 10,000% increase as it looks in nominal terms. It's actually roughly a 66% increase in purchasing power that someone has received over sort of 40 years. Okay, it's large. For the most part, it's just protecting your wealth against monetary debasement. As long as this debt in the government balance sheet continues to rack up, as it is today, we're going to have to continue to debase the currency in order to pay for this debt. So that's why this meme is true, in that there is no top when it comes to real estate prices. There is no top when it comes to the stock market, nor is there no top when it comes to the price of Bitcoin, because there is no bottom when it comes to the value of the currency. Unfortunately, though, many countries in the world don't have strong property rights, and those citizens within them don't have the ability to store their wealth in many good assets. Okay, so places like Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Lebanon, Sudan, Argentina, Turkey, they can't just put their money into the US stock market. The infrastructure may not be built in those countries for that to even happen, or the local governments won't even allow that to happen. And then property, if they wanted to store their wealth in real estate, there's a high chance that if it's of any value, it will get confiscated either by the government itself or by warlords or local gangs. What do these people do? They are forced to have to try and find US dollars in a lot of cases. They try to find US dollars in order to store their wealth in, or they suffer from hyperinflation of their local currency and effectively get poorer. There are estimated to be roughly 250 million people affected by hyperinflation each year, and 2 billion people are unbanked, and so it's extremely difficult, makes it extremely difficult to run a business or make and receive payments safely. And they're estimated to be 5.7 billion people living under autocracy. So any ability to protest or speak freely risks financial repression. So what Bitcoin offers the world, especially the world where we have 4.3 billion people who are using a smartphone with internet access, is a home, a digital home, if you like, where they can store their wealth and protect against inflation. It also gives them a bank or a digital bank so they can actually start to run their own businesses without fear or risk of theft, and also gives them the confidence and freedom to protest and speak freely, or even just vote with their feet and move countries with their wealth intact. That's what Bitcoin offers for the people of the developing world. So we just have a quick look at the countries with the highest use of cryptocurrencies. A lot of these countries are the countries that are experiencing these problems that I mentioned, and that is why they are using digital monies like Bitcoin and stablecoins, which are just digital versions of the US dollar. So yeah, they have a high need for this type of technology, and that's why they're typically using it more than us in the rich, developed world. There is a myth that you might hear that Bitcoin is for criminals. For every $1 spent in money laundered with Bitcoin, $800 is laundered with US dollar. It's actually very poor. It's actually a very poor idea to use Bitcoin for criminal activity because it is an open blockchain. It is an open protocol, so it can be tracked by government agencies quite easily. Important to note that it's not anonymous, but it is private. And so the difference between those two is something for another day, but it doesn't mean you lack any privacy with Bitcoin. There are ways to make it private, but it doesn't mean you're anonymous. So if governments want to work out who you are and how you're using the Bitcoin, they can, especially if you've KYC'd AML exchanges. It makes it a lot easier. But that's a topic for another day. So we've discussed that Bitcoin is an emerging store of value and has the potential to become a medium of exchange, but it's not being used as a medium of exchange yet, and it's certainly not a unit of account. So how does it get to becoming a medium of exchange and a unit of account? Well, we need to ensure Bitcoin maintains high uptime. We need to educate people as to what it is, and we need to keep building solutions to make it easier to use, but also more scalable so more people can get access to the protocol. Bitcoin is volatile at the moment, like I said earlier, because it's actually just so tiny. The asset class is just so tiny compared to the rest of the assets that it's bumping up against. So Bitcoin is like this small, tiny rock pool located next to a violent ocean, which is the world's currencies and the world's wealth in other assets. And when that wealth starts to pour into Bitcoin, it becomes quite violent, and you lead to this high rates of volatility in the Bitcoin price. Because Bitcoin itself is highly transparent, and you can predict way out into 100 years, into 2140, the full-on issuance schedule or the monetary policy of Bitcoin is known forever, really. It's all public knowledge, it's transparent, you can verify that. So it's nothing inherent about Bitcoin itself that makes it volatile. It's more the users interacting with the protocol that makes Bitcoin volatile. And it's typically fear and greed. People sell when it's down, and they don't understand, and also it's worse because they don't understand what Bitcoin is, and so there's an ignorance to it. So they sell out of fear. It creates very low lows, and then people get greedy as well when the price starts to revert, and they buy in at all-time highs, and they get greedy, and the price gets blown way over its expected valuation. So Bitcoin does require a lot of education, and this is what I'm trying to help people understanding what Bitcoin is so that they don't sell out of fear or ignorance. We've also, in the last cycle, had a lot of bankruptcies in centralized companies who provided access to Bitcoin and provided financial products around the ecosystem, but they over-levered themselves and they went bust. So that was like BlockFi and FTX and Terra Luna, and this unwinding of all the leverage, they were effectively, I like to call them degenerate gamblers. This unwinding led to extreme Bitcoin volatility and sell-offs because they were effectively just scammers carrying out illegal activities, and as a result had to sell off their Bitcoin and then dumped the price. But the good thing about Bitcoin as itself was that these scammers couldn't prevail. No one could bail them out. Bitcoin didn't bail them out. If you carry out scammy conduct, you will be destroyed if you're trying to do that on the Bitcoin standard. So that is the good thing. It weeds out the scammers from those who are trustworthy. When you're interacting with Bitcoin, dollar cost averaging is key. I'm trying to illustrate here. If you bought Bitcoin at a monthly timescale, so every month, this orange line would be your experience with Bitcoin. It would be far less volatile. So if you can remove the emotion of buying the highs and selling these lows and just stick to a plan over a long time frame, your relative experience of volatility will reduce significantly. I also hear this a lot from people who sort of don't understand Bitcoin, is what is it backed by? So to understand this, you have to know that this term was invented in 1913 when the Federal Reserve notes were to be backed by gold. Because they were issuing Federal Reserve notes, they weren't issuing gold. They had to be, people didn't trust it, so they had to be backed by something people trusted, and that was gold. So what is gold backed by? Well, it's backed by the properties, its monetary properties, store of wealth, medium exchange, unit of account, and by the users or the network of users who all agree that this has value, which it's not an illusion. Gold has been tested over millennia for its monetary properties. And so it's emerged as the king money for natural money. And so it's not like these people are in some sort of collective delusion or it's some sort of hallucination. You cannot print more gold. If you could, it would no longer be money. So its properties, along with the fact that the people realize its properties and understand its properties, that's what backs gold as a valuable money. So what is Bitcoin backed by? Again, backed by, like gold, its monetary properties and by the network of users who agree and have verified these properties to be true and real. Now, these users are smaller than gold at the moment, but they are growing once people sort of understand more about what Bitcoin is. What is fiat backed by? It's not backed by gold anymore, but it's backed by its monetary properties and by the network of users who agree that it is of value. And these users, for example, in the United States, are the US citizens. People say it's backed by the government. No, it's backed. It is in a way, but it's also not. It's backed by the government, yes, but the government is backed by the people. So fundamentally, the US dollar is backed by the people who back the government, who issues the currency. Bitcoin just cuts out the middleman. Bitcoin is a money that doesn't require an issuer, and so it just cuts out the middlemen, as long as the people decide that it is of value. So what is the big idea here? Bitcoin is ledger commodity money, secured by physics, established in a bottoms-up fashion, and distributed in a decentralized fashion. So like a home stores wealth and protects you against monetary inflation, Bitcoin can also offer that solution. It can also give you a type of bank account, gives you the freedom of speech and the freedom of protest against autocracies. That's what the promise of Bitcoin offers the world's 8 billion. So Bitcoin is emergent money going through its store of value phase. So Bitcoin and energy. It's quite common, and even I thought this as well, that Bitcoin's energy usage is due to its inability to process transactions efficiently. But that's incorrect. You could process all of Bitcoin's transactions all the way back to Genesis on a Raspberry Pi computer. In fact, you can process all the transactions in real time on the Raspberry Pi computer. We call them Bitcoin nodes. They're important to ensure that the consensus rules within the network are maintained. So the vast amounts of energy usage within Bitcoin is not to process transactions. It's actually to build a defensive wall of energy. And this wall of energy is required to protect the property rights of its users. Okay? So it's actually a wall of energy, an encrypted wall of energy. It's nothing to do with the processing of the transactions. It's everything to do with protecting the users from hackers, from thieves, from scammers, even protection from the environment. Bitcoin doesn't corrode. It doesn't get affected by flooding. This wall of energy ensures that the user's rights, the property rights, are protected. So we know that energy secures the network by creating this encrypted wall of energy. And so it requires real-world resources, so electricity and compute. And this imposes a significant opportunity cost to those who wish to attack the network. And so because it's incredibly expensive to attack Bitcoin, it makes more sense that if you've got those resources to even think about attacking it, you might as well use those resources in favor of Bitcoin and then get paid in Bitcoin and earn a profit. And so there's a profit motive to cooperate with the network as opposed to corrupting it. So it's unlikely an individual or an economic rational individual or company would bother to try and break the network. They're more likely to cooperate with the network and contribute to the wall of energy. Governments may have a non-economic incentive to attack it, but they're going to have to redirect a lot of resources, money, infrastructure away from solving other problems just to purely attack Bitcoin. This wouldn't go down well with the electorate, especially as they could make a profit by mining the Bitcoin. Another important point is the energy is decentralized. Okay, so it's effectively not monopolized because energy it's found all over the world, and so you'll have mining units placed all over the world. So that contributes to the decentralized nature of Bitcoin. So the security isn't in any one place. And more so, the cheapest energy can be found in some of the most remote places of the world because that's where nobody is. So that's even more secure because the infrastructure protecting Bitcoin is in remote areas, very distant, in very distant locations to our other parts of society. Because you have high costs in terms of building this encrypted wall of energy, in terms of paying for the electricity and the compute and the maintenance, that you actually are forced to sell the Bitcoin that you earn. So this means that the miners distribute the Bitcoin among the users, therefore reducing centralization risk of the Bitcoin asset itself. And it's important to note that the Bitcoin mining consensus mechanism disconnects ownership of Bitcoin from control over the network. So just because you may have a lot of Bitcoin doesn't mean that you have the ability to, say, control the network or make it any less secure. Remember, in the rich West, we have real estate as our primary store of wealth vehicle. And we do that because we want to protect against monetary debasement, but also because we can do that because we have secure or strong property rights. We have generally effective and low corrupt politicians, lawyers, police, and the military. But importantly, this all takes vast amounts of energy. It's channeled energy through a culture that can achieve this, but nonetheless, it does require energy in order to have strong property rights. What Bitcoin does is takes this in its most pure form, energy, and protects itself with it. Bitcoin doesn't have access to lawyers, police, and military, but it does have access to pure energy, pure encrypted energy. And that is what it takes from the current system and protects itself. So I mentioned it's encrypted energy, and that's because the energy is being pumped through specialized computers called ASICs, and they are creating 711 exahash per second of computing power. And to give you a sense of the scale of that, you could point all of the world's cloud computing infrastructure towards Bitcoin and attack it, and you wouldn't make a dent. So there's currently 20 gigawatts of electrical power backing the network, and that's being pumped through the computing power to produce 711 exahash per second. So it's a sense of scale of the amount of energy that is the equivalent of the amount of energy that the US Navy can currently project at any given moment. There's also some economic power protecting Bitcoin. $1.3 trillion has been invested, and 100 million hodlers are protecting Bitcoin in a political aspect. But typically, it's the encrypted energy that's the most important thing that's securing the Bitcoin. People sometimes have concerns about that amount of energy being pumped through the Bitcoin network, but their concerns really lie in where the energy comes from. Okay, if the energy comes from oil, coal, or gas, then yeah, we've got a concern. But if it's coming from green renewable energies, then this isn't a problem. So we really have to detach the idea that energy consumption is bad from energy production. Okay, so if you've got a concern with Bitcoin consuming energy, surely you've got a concern with theme parks, Teslas, fairy lights. And if you still have a concern about Bitcoin using energy compared to those, it's probably because you don't understand the value that Bitcoin brings, which in case you probably want to continue watching this or rewatch it from the start. Because Bitcoin does offer a lot of value. And also we've got to think that if we're going to be a sufficiently advanced civilization, we're going to be consuming a lot more energy than we are today. We just have to do it in a renewable fashion. Ideally, where we would consume as much energy as the sun produces. That's how we'd become a Type 1 and Type 2 Kardashev scale civilization. It is quite well known that generally the wealthier countries, the countries with the least poverty, consume the most energy. So energy consumption isn't a bad thing. It's where it's produced is the bad thing. Just as perspective, Bitcoin's share of global energy consumption is 0.26%. That's perhaps the thickness of this line in this pie chart. It produces a little more energy than gold, but it has far less environmental consequences. And Bitcoin really consumes a little bit less energy than, say, data centers or data networks, more sort of equivalent to copper mining. And there's actually 12 times less energy consumption than the banking sector. So if you're going to criticize Bitcoin's energy, you have to take a look at the current financial system as well. Bitcoin ranks just behind South Africa in terms of its consumption, and it has approximately the same number of users as Vietnam. Okay, to understand why, again, even further, why this isn't a bad thing, and actually Bitcoin's energy consumption is trending in a really positive way, is you have to understand the economics of Bitcoin mining, or this is the process of building that energy wall. Okay, so Bitcoin mining is a commoditized industry, and so what that means is that they cannot set the price. They're price takers. The market sets the price of the amount of revenue that Bitcoin miners will receive for mining Bitcoin, and that's it. They have no control. They cannot. It's not like Apple where they can set, Apple, the company, where they can set the price of a laptop or an iPhone, because they are certainly not a commoditized industry. Bitcoin mining is, and so it makes it. This is what makes it a very difficult industry to actually operate in. And so if you're in a situation where you're a commoditized industry and your price takers in terms of revenue, the only two things you can actually do to increase your profit is to lower your costs. And you can do that by upgrading your equipment, but that only gets you so far, and there's also more upfront capital costs to do that, so you have to do the math on that one. But also the best thing really is to find cheaper energy. So if you find cheap energy, you can increase your profit. And the cheapest energy is actually found away from where the average retail consumer is, which is in the cities. And cheaper energy is typically is found at the source of energy production, where the demand typically isn't. And the unfortunate thing for Bitcoin miners is, if they manage to find cheaper energy, given enough time, because of the issuance schedule of Bitcoin, the revenue tends to come down as well over time. And so they have to consistently upgrade equipment and find cheaper energy in order to stay profitable. It's this constant war between a reducing revenue and trying to lower their costs so they can make a profit. Eventually it'll stabilize, but at the moment the trend is that revenue is going down, but also the costs are coming down too, as they find more cheaper, abundant energy that's not being utilized, and the equipment of the mining equipment is improving and becoming more efficient over time. So like I said, the cheaper energy is where it's not being used by consumers, and the good thing is that there's a lot of this energy in the world. There's actually a lot of waste. Just in the US alone, there is 206 terawatt hours of electricity that's being wasted. So this could power the Bitcoin network 1.2 times. Global gas flaring recovery potential could power the entire Bitcoin network 4 times. That's literally wasted energy that no one uses when you're trying to extract oil from the ground, which we'll talk about a little bit later. To give you further insight about how much wasted energy there is, this is in the US. Actually, 67% of energy produced is wasted or stranded, and only 33% is utilized. If we zoom in on just the electrical component, 35% is utilized and 65% of energy is wasted or stranded. Now, this isn't because of incompetence, or this is just economics. Where the electricity is being generated, there's not enough demand, and the demand for electricity isn't happening constantly. It comes in waves, and if you don't use electricity when it's generated, you lose it. It's like a flowing, it just flows, and if you don't use it, it has to be earthed. It's just wasted. You can't store it. We don't have the batteries at scale to be able to store that energy. So electricity is you use it or lose it, and most of the time we lose it. So this is where a good chunk of Bitcoin mining is being carried out. And this is why it shouldn't be such a concern when you see the amount of energy that the amount of energy that's being pumped into the Bitcoin network, because a lot of it wasn't going to be used by anyone anyway. So to help you visualize this, I have power here on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and this pink here is the energy demand, and it comes in cycles, right? So peaks, at night when people are using their energy, and then in the day when they're at work or when they're sleeping, there's a trough and they're not using the energy. But we need energy to be supplied at a level that will meet the demand, because if it doesn't, that's when you get if your demand peaks over the available supply, that's when you get brownouts or blackouts. Okay, so you have to have more supply running than demand, and then that energy is wasted. Okay, but if you plug a Bitcoin miner to these energy generators, that can be a great tool to suck up any of the wasted energy and make use of that. Okay, turn that wasted energy literally into money. Okay, and the good thing about Bitcoin miners is that they are a continuous demand application for this wasted energy. They are very flexible in location because they're quite nimble and mobile, these Bitcoin miners, and they are very flexible in their demand response. So they can be switched off and on whenever needed without affecting the network because it's sufficiently decentralized. So this leads to a more stable grid, and it actually lowers energy prices for consumers. You will be able to increase the power surplus here without increasing costs. So this leads to a more efficient grid. Another way of putting it is through, with AC generators, they have a frequency that they need to maintain. That's, in this case, around 50 hertz. If you have shocks to the system where you have increases in consumers demanding electricity, then it can lower the frequency and thus affect some of the infrastructure. The infrastructure can be affected by these shocks of frequency. Same thing if there's a shock in terms of a lack of demand, you can lead to a high increase of frequency. Again, this can disrupt infrastructure if it's not. That's why having a balanced grid is super important. Bitcoin can do this, can offer a solution to be turned on. Bitcoin miners can be turned on to consume electricity if there are a drop in consumption, and turned off when there's a dramatic increase in consumption, thus creating a more balanced grid. And how Bitcoin, to understand the economics, how Bitcoin can sort of reduce the costs for consumers. At the moment, without a Bitcoin miner, 100% of the costs of this energy generation is paid by the consumers, even though they're not using all of the energy that is being created by the energy generator. But if you were to use Bitcoin mining in this case, as an example, 30% of the costs will be paid by the Bitcoiner, so therefore only 70% of the costs will be applied to the consumer. So you're sharing the costs of the infrastructure to be built because you have continuous demand. There is more demand paying for that infrastructure. And this isn't just theoretical, this is actually happening around the world. So geothermal data centers are happening in Iceland, volcano data center in El Salvador, solar power data centers in the USA, hydropower data center in Paraguay, wind power data center in Latvia. And then now there's publications coming out noticing this, that the market is seeing Bitcoin as a great tool to help reduce the costs of energy generation. But more importantly, it's if you have access to geothermal or hydro power and you're not using it at all, Bitcoin mining incentivizes you to go out and build infrastructure to generate electricity from those sources because it's literally free money. If you have volcanoes in your backyard, you might as well tap a Bitcoin miner and use that geothermal energy. It's just getting wasted anyway. The heat is leaving the planet, leaving the earth. You might as well capture that and turn that into some money. So in a way, if you have geothermal or hydro, it's effectively like having gold. Now, Bitcoin enables you to profit off of those natural resources. So what is the big idea? Bitcoin literally creates a wall of energy around its users to protect their property rights. Bitcoin mining enables you to capitalize off natural resources like geothermal or hydro and actually subsidize the build out of these energy generators. And it can balance the grid, thus making it more efficient and lower cost. So Bitcoin and the environment. So Bitcoin's share in terms of metric tons of CO2 equivalent is 0.18%. So put that in context, that's a little less than gold mining. And actually it ranks just behind Venezuela in terms of the amount of pollution if Bitcoin were to be a country. So Bitcoin isn't perfect in terms of its environmental impact, but the good thing is that its sustainable energy mix is improving, and it's currently sitting at 54.5%. So as more and more renewable infrastructure gets built out, Bitcoin will probably be involved in that, and more energy will be directed, or more energy in the Bitcoin network will be coming from those sources. And that's largely just due to economics as well and political incentives. So the cheapest energy is actually from the renewable energy sources, especially as we go over time. This will be certainly the case because non-renewable energies get used up and then thus become more expensive over time. Whereas renewable energy is renewable, and so it should be more cheaper over the long run, and therefore Bitcoin should use more and more of this over time. Plus, there are regulations in place that ensure that Bitcoin is being pushed towards renewable energy rather than non-renewable energy. So Bitcoin mining is about 55% green energy mix. If you compare that across other sectors, you have banking sector, which is almost 40%, industrial sector 32%, gold industry almost 13%, for example. So quite good when you compare to other industries. So Bitcoin here is where it is in its little bubble of CO2 production. It's definitely less than data centers and gold mining, tobacco. It's just a little bit more than tobacco. Definitely less than TVs, TV networks, and electronics. And when you compare it to, say, gas flaring and landfills, this is a lot of CO2 being wasted in these two areas that Bitcoin can actually help reduce, which we'll talk about in a next. So methane gas flaring is super important. When you're mining for oil, there's natural gas that sits in the oil wells, and sometimes that natural gas is used and funneled out and used as energy and transported as energy. But not all of it is. There's a lot of wells in the world that is just too far away and it's too expensive to transport that gas. Okay, so it requires specialist, pretty expensive infrastructure to move gas around. So what they do is they just vent it. Now, sometimes these energy companies who are extracting this oil, they will flare the methane. Okay, which is great, but not always they will, because there is a cost to it and it becomes, economically unviable to do so. Or they just don't want to spend the money to flare the methane. Now, it's important to flare the methane because methane is 80 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. Okay, so it's incredibly damaging as a greenhouse gas, and so it's important that it's better to burn it to CO2 than to keep it as methane, for example. And there's 120 metric tons of CH4 methane released annually, so it's quite a significant amount of greenhouse gas being emitted annually that we should be trying to get rid of. Now, this was a white paper released by the White House Office of Science and Technology, and they actually concluded that Bitcoin could yield positive results for the climate and is more likely to help rather than hinder US climate objectives because of its ability to incentivize building out methane gas flaring. And Hivian Energy, they did a calculation that mining 1 Bitcoin with vented CH4 is equivalent to taking 1,400 passenger vehicles off the road. So to help you understand the economics of how this makes sense, you're an energy company and you're looking to extract oil from a well. Now, if the costs of building out the infrastructure to flare the methane that comes out of the oil well are too high, then the project viability doesn't make sense. They're not going to build out the infrastructure to flare the gas. They're just going to allow it to vent into the atmosphere. This happens all the time. Very regular occurrence in the energy industry, and governments are trying to regulate around the world that this shouldn't happen, but it's not always effective, and not all jurisdictions are going to do that as well. what we need is economic incentives to try and build out the flaring infrastructure. So if you tap Bitcoin mining onto these wells, you can actually reduce the costs, right? So the revenue could come in and help subsidize the cost of building that infrastructure and therefore make the project more viable. Maybe in some cases, the costs, there still will be cost to the company, but it'd be less than they would otherwise would be, so they would be happy to take the hit. But in some cases, the Bitcoin revenue is so much more that they can actually make a profit. And so they're almost definitely going to build out the infrastructure to flare the methane, to turn that methane and that heat into electricity and then create money from the Bitcoin mining. A similar concept can be applied in landfill gas. So 50% of US landfills vent their CH4 emissions, and the other 50%, they use that methane gas to generate electricity and pump that into the grid. But not always this makes economic sense because those landfills aren't close to any demand. So in those cases, you can tap a Bitcoin miner onto those landfills and start, to pay for the infrastructure to burn it and then to turn it into electricity. And this is what Nodal Power is doing in the US. So they don't have enough demand around in some landfill areas, so they build out the infrastructure and pump that electricity into Bitcoin mining, thus flaring the methane gas, turning it into CO2, and thus reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that landfill produces. So a Bitcoin mining case study happened in Africa during COVID. So when COVID happened, the tourism dropped off and it became very difficult for that national park to stay solvent, to pay for all the infrastructure, the employees, the security to prevent poachers, things like this. So what they did is, with their current hydropowered plants, they put on 10 shipping containers, each with 250 to 500 mining rigs, and turned those hydropower plants into money. They were able to, at one point, produce $150,000 per month, and this effectively saved the national park from bankruptcy. Other examples, World Economic Forum is talking about how being able to generate money from renewable energy sources or available energy sources can help produce and encourage to help enable commerce in developing countries. And just to help you understand again the economics of how Bitcoin subsidizes the build out of new renewable energy sources. So say you have some natural resources where you have a potential dam that could be built, or you have some geothermal. Now, if the costs outweigh the potential revenue, i.e. the demand for that electricity every year, then it's unlikely the project's going to be built unless it's heavily subsidized by the government. So what Bitcoin can do is push that revenue or that demand over the costs, thus making the project economically viable and sustainable even without government intervention. And there's an academic paper showing that this is actually possible, and the market is actually doing this already. So what is the big idea? Bitcoin reduces methane emissions by incentivizing the build out of methane flaring infrastructure and methane flaring infrastructure on landfills. It also incentivizes new renewable energy projects. So I'm going to take you through Bitcoin versus crypto. So technically, yes, Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency, but this really does confuse people because actually Bitcoin is unique from the rest. And so this is why you'll hear people say it's Bitcoin, not crypto. Okay? You can categorize crypto into two, one being crypto commodities, where you have Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, Monero, Zcash, Dogecoin, and then crypto securities. And the popular ones would be Ethereum, Solana, Binance, XRP, Avalanche, Cardano. Let's focus on the crypto commodities part. Why is Bitcoin different from the rest of the crypto commodities? So Bitcoin has pretty much all of the computational power. directed at it, 99% of it, in fact. It also has 82% of all the electrical power being directed towards Bitcoin, which is interesting because it just shows you how inefficient the other digital monies are, in that they are taking up a lot of energy, but they actually haven't got that much hash rate. And it has all the monetary power as well, 96% of the monetary power. So 96% of the market cap of all of these crypto commodities is within Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is the dominant and the winning crypto commodity. Crypto securities, they're quite different. So they have a different consensus mechanism. They typically have a proof of stake model or something like that. So they're not connected to energy. They're not using proof of work as their consensus model, their security model. But more importantly, they are more equivalent to, say, a stock of a company. That's what a security is or means. It's like Apple stock is a security, okay? And you know what a security is by ticking off a few of these items in the Howey test. So we can compare the two, crypto commodities versus crypto securities. Crypto securities began with an investment of money. So effectively, an entity or group of people raised money from venture capitalists or investors in order to build out the project. Crypto commodities didn't. They were just launched. There was no money involved, fundraising at all. It's just the launch, and then the project took off. There's an expectation of profits. So there's no expectation of profits with crypto commodities on any counterparty, but there is with crypto securities. You're expecting that some entity will create some sort of profit, or when you're buying into the token, you're going to be making a profit off that token, in particular because there is a common enterprise that you're relying on to do the work, to do the marketing, to do the investing in R&D, and also, so therefore, you're relying on the efforts of others. And this is a good example of this was when Ethereum moved from proof of work to proof of stake. It required developers, you trust in these developers who are funded by the Ethereum Foundation to move the protocol from one consensus mechanism to another. So that was an investment of money with the expectation of profits from a common enterprise and relying on the efforts of others. You don't necessarily need to take my word for it. The SEC is going after a lot of these tokens. They've gone after Binance, they've gone after XRP, they'll probably will eventually go after Solana, and it looks like they're going after Ethereum as we speak. So Bitcoin, in a nutshell, is separate to crypto, in that it is the dominant crypto commodity, but it's also not a crypto security. I also get this a lot, and people think that Bitcoin, because it's the first one, it'll be replaced by another one. Bitcoin is not just the first one, it's the first one that's worked. It's the first digital money that's sufficiently decentralized that has actually been successful. There's been many years, decades of development to try to achieve this feat, and there's been almost about 10 different attempts to try and build out a digital money, but they've all failed, and they've all failed largely because they had a centralization risk. They were centralized, and that allowed governments to either shut it down or hackers to corrupt the network. This is the thing about this kind of digital money. It's either a 1 or a 0. It's either going to be worth a lot of money or it's going to be worth nothing at all. It's unlikely to be somewhere in the middle. And so this is what we're seeing play out with Bitcoin. So navigating Bitcoin cycles. Bitcoin behaves in these cycles, and so we're just finishing up on the 4th cycle. And the reason why we have these cycles is largely to do with the issuance schedule of Bitcoin. So the amount of new Bitcoin supply coming onto the market halves every 4 years, and so there is a coinciding increase in price when that happens, usually within 6 months to 1 year. But it's not necessarily just because of the issuance supply schedule, but it could be to do with liquidity factors in the macroeconomic environment as well. But typically there are cycles, and we all in the Bitcoin community agree on this. And so you just have to know that. And if you want to invest in Bitcoin, you have to know where you are in the cycle, right? So there are bull markets in the cycle. These are these green arrows, and there are bear markets in the cycle. Okay, so typically it's great to invest at the bottom of bear markets where everyone is most depressed. Okay, and then and this is where the hardcore Bitcoin maxis like myself would buy the Bitcoin at those points. And then typically you don't really want to buy when it's really peaking at the top of the bull markets when everyone's euphoric. Okay, so you have to know where you are in this, and it'll especially help you to understand these cycles if you're holding through a bear market, so you know that this is actually the normal state of where Bitcoin is at in its life cycle. So the key is that you should dollar cost average, okay, because you can't really time when you're going to be at the top, when you're going to be at the bottom. So you should be just buying at regular intervals and not having to worry about timing markets. You shouldn't measure the success of the Bitcoin project by the price, at least in the short term, because you're going to get times when it's euphoric and the price is overblown, and therefore then it's going to eventually correct. And you're also going to get times when it's oversold, and that it will then correct to the upside because it's actually worth more than what the market is feeling, because the sentiment is quite bearish and depressed and emotional, and there's a lot of fear. So you shouldn't be measuring the success in the short term of Bitcoin by price, but over the long term, yes, because if we are, obtaining more trust in the network and it's actually being used more and more, and there's more development going on, then you'd expect the price to go up over time. But typically the best metric to follow is how healthy the community is. Is there development going on? Is there companies building on top of it? What's the general sentiment of people? Is it improving or is it declining? Those things, which are much more difficult to measure, should be your gauge. And the only way to sort of get that is to be involved in the community and sort of actively keeping up to date with what's happening. So there are personas of the investors in Bitcoin that you should be aware of. You've got the maxis, or the Bitcoiners, and these guys are like myself, and they love the Bitcoin, and they will buy and hold, and they truly understand the project and the mission. And so they are the ones who are constant buyers. Then you got the traders, and they come and go during the bull markets to make money, and then they leave during the bear markets. And so you've got to watch out for them. So when the price is starting to go up, that's when they come on board and just jump on the train. And then you've got the investors, the new investors, that can be called retail, and they come in typically only when the price has been going up for a while, and then they come in at the tops, and then unfortunately a lot of them get wrecked and they sell out. And the traders sell out too because they're just in it for a quick buck, and then the maxis just come in and start buying the cheap Bitcoin. The good thing is that a lot of these investors and traders do become Bitcoin maxis. There is an evolution as they learn more about what this asset really is. And so, I've bought every top, and I'll be buying the top forever. That's just the nature of the monetary system at the moment, and also the fact that Bitcoin is monetizing. But also bought the dips, okay? And this is just dollar cost averaging, okay? So don't worry if you're buying the top. Just don't buy too much at the tops, or if you're buying at highs, you don't know where the top is. But if you're buying at highs, you buy little bits when it's high, okay? And don't worry, because all of us maxis will be buying the top forever. It's going up forever because the dollar is going down forever. So this again is where this meme is so important to sort of understand. You'll know when you become a Bitcoiner when this meme makes sense to you. That Bitcoin will eventually be the unit of account. So it's not something that you necessarily sell. You can sell it to buy things, but the Bitcoiner understands that this will be the money that people will want to own. So So the risks of Bitcoin. Well, there are risks. It's not a perfect investment at this stage. If there was no risks, there'd be no reward. Bitcoin would be at $1 million plus by now. So the risks are that there may be, you don't want development stagnation. If I see there's stagnation in terms of developing on Bitcoin, I'd be concerned, but I don't see that at the moment. If there's community stagnation and people just are giving up on the project, if there's centralization in the protocol, so if there's few nodes or mining is becoming highly centralized, then that's a concern. Are we achieving more and more legal acceptance and political acceptance? Typically in the West, we are seeing this trending in the right direction. There'll be others among you who have concerns such as, will it be banned, copied, hacked, or replaced? So will it be banned? I'm not too worried about it being banned in the developed world because we actually have strong property rights and the courts have Bitcoin as facts because it is just property rights. Now, if our countries become quite dystopian in terms of our laws and authoritarian, then yes, then it'll become a concern to hold Bitcoin. But as far as what I can see is we're still okay. We're still democratic liberal nations, and so it should uphold property rights for Bitcoin holders. Can it be copied? It's been copied 10,000 times already, but that doesn't do anything to Bitcoin because you can copy the protocol, but you can't copy the network. You can't copy the network of miners securing it, the computers securing it, the individuals themselves. Can it be hacked? Well, it's 15 years in and it hasn't been hacked yet. And it's so simple that it's open source that we've got a million eyes looking at the code and looking at trying to find ways to hack it. It hasn't been hacked yet. So as time goes on, the risk of this comes less and less. Then of course people will say, what about if quantum computing comes about? Well, actually quantum secure cryptography does exist already and it can be implemented on Bitcoin. So whenever quantum computers come about, we just introduce the quantum secure cryptography into Bitcoin. You don't throw out the entire protocol because you have to replace a few algorithms. You don't throw the whole idea of a computer out the door because quantum computers are in existence. You update your computers to be quantum resistant. Can it be replaced? Could be, but it'll take some sort of technology that is an order of magnitude better than Bitcoin, and we would see it on the horizon. So I don't see anything on the horizon that's going to be able to replace Bitcoin from a monetary point of view at this stage. The Bitcoin really fits into the decentralized standard. Okay, so we decentralize our politics in terms of, and how we apply that is through democracy. We decentralize our markets through capitalism. We decentralize our information through the internet. And I believe in a few years or decades, we'll decentralize the money through Bitcoin. They all have a common set of values in that they are all decentralized in governance. They are all bottoms-up systems. They are generally transparent. They bring freedom to the individual, and they create a permissionless infrastructure so that if you want to go create a business, you can. If you want to go use the internet, you can. If you want to vote, you can. And they all generally tilt the balance of power to the individual. Bitcoin is ESG, okay? So we know now that it's good for the environment. We know that it's great socially in that it's providing property rights to the world's poor. And it's got as good a governance as all of these other systems we use. Democracy, capitalism, and the internet. It's great. It's got great governance because no one is in control. But yet everyone is a player in the system. And this is being reported on now more widely, both in academia but in industry. KPMG released a report on Bitcoin's role in the ESG imperative. And BlackRock, one of the issuers of the Bitcoin ETP, is effectively the father institution of ESG, and they approve of Bitcoin. So finally, Bitcoin is hope, and you can go to hope.com. Literally, you can go to hope.com and learn more about Bitcoin. Some more resources for you to learn if you wish. The bullish case for Bitcoin, progressive case for Bitcoin. All of these books are great and worth a read. So if you're a beginner, probably start here on the top line. If you're getting more advanced, then you want to start looking here at the bottom line of these resources here. Finally, you don't have to trust me. You can verify all of this yourself. This is just research that I've done in the space of the last few years. So I hope you enjoyed that. Cheers.